All right, so today we're examining Europe between 1200 and 1450. So, unlike Southern China and many Islamic states, Europe was not really politically unified. So, instead, Europe was categorized by feudalism and mannerism and the influence of the Catholic Church. So, as we move through this lesson, I want you to focus on three big ideas. First, how religion shaped European society. Second, how feudalism organized politics, how the manorial system organized the economy. So if you can explain the difference between feudalism and manorialism by the end of this lesson, you'll be in great shape for the AP exam. So religion was one of the most powerful forces in medieval Europe. So the Catholic Church really influenced nearly every aspect of daily life. It shaped the education, the politics, law, and culture. So in a continent divided into many kingdoms and territories, Christianity provided a sense of unity. So monasteries preserved knowledge by copying manuscripts and preserving classical texts. Universities emerged during this time under the influence of the church and became centers of learning. The Jewish communities also contributed to European societies through trade, finance, and scholarships. However, the Jewish population also frequently faced persecution and discrimination during this period, especially at times of religious tension in the continent. So at the same time, contact with the Islamic world exposed Europe to new ideas. In places like Spain, Christians, Muslims, and Jews interacted, traded, and exchanged knowledge. Many Greek works had then been preserved and expanded upon by Muslim scholars. Were also reintroduced to Europe during this time. So this slide introduces one of the most important systems in medieval Europe, feudalism. So feudalism was Europe's political system. So because Europe lacked a strong centralized government, people needed protection from invasion and warfare. So as a result, local relationships became extremely important. So the king would grant land called fiefs to nobles. So there was like a hierarchical thing in Europe as well. So the nobles would then promise loyalty and military service to the king. So the nobles could then grant the land they were given to knights. So the knights would then promise military service and protection as well. So this kind of created a chain of obligation throughout society. So a simple way to remember feudalism is land equals loyalty, land equals military service, land equals power. So under feudalism, kings often struggled to control powerful nobles. So the Magna Carta is a perfect example of this. So in 1215, and if you remember from last year, we took Gov. You should have talked about the Magna Carta. So in 1215, English nobles forced King John to sign the Magna Carta, limiting his authority and establishing that even the king had to obey the law. So for AP World, just remember feudalism is about politics, government, and military obligation. Now, this slide also contains one of the most important concepts in medieval Europe, the manorial system. So students often confuse feudalism and manorialism. So think about it this way. Feudalism answers the question, who rules? Manorialism answered the question, how do people survive? So the manor was a large agricultural estate that was controlled by a lord. So more peasants lived on a manor. So everything the community needed was typically produced on that manor. So food, clothing, tools, housing. In many ways, manors were almost self-sufficient. The majority of the peasants were what are called serfs. So a serf was not enslaved technically, but a serf was legally tied to the land. So serfs could not freely leave the manor. So in exchange for protection, serfs farmed the land, paid rent, provided labor services to the lord. So this system provided stability but limited social mobility of the peasants. So most people spent their entire lives working for the same land. So agricultural innovations really helped improve production. The heavy plow allowed farmers to work year thick soils more efficiently. The three field system rotated crops and increased yields. So these innovations really increased food production and supported population growth. So for you as an AP student, if you see agriculture, estate, serfs, peasant, or self-sufficient communities, think manorialism. If you see kings, nobles, vassals, and military service, think feudalism. So Europe society was highly hierarchical. At the top stood kings and nobles, below them were knights and clergy, and at the bottom were the peasants and the serfs. So the Catholic Church played a major role in maintaining social order. So church officials provided education, they cared for the poor, and offered religious guidance. Jewish communities played an important role in trade and finance, despite experiencing discrimination and persecution. So, contact with the Islamic world brought new ideas into Europe. Mathematics, medicine, science, architecture, and philosophy all benefited from the interactions with the Islamic societies. Um, yeah. So, by the 1300s, Europe began experiencing major changes. The most significant event was the Black Death. So, the plague killed roughly one third of Europe's population. This created a large labor shortage throughout Europe. So, because workers became scarce, surviving peasants suddenly gained leverage. So, they could demand higher wages and better treatment. So, as a result, the feudal and manorial system began to weaken. We also see growing tension between social classes, which led to the Peasant Revolt in England, which demonstrated frustration with the traditional social structure. So, at the same time, monarchs began centralizing power. So the Hundred Years' War helped strengthen the monarchies and reduce the influence of many feudal nobles. So these developments really laid the groundwork for stronger nation states. So meanwhile, increased access to classical knowledge contributed to the beginning of the Renaissance, which we'll talk about that a little bit more in the course. Europe was slowly transitioning away from the medieval world. So if you're studying for your AP exam, so to kind of summarize all this together, so remember these key takeaways. The Catholic Church dominated religious life and influenced politics, education, and culture. Feudalism was the political system based on land, loyalty, and military service. Manorialism was the economic system based on self sufficient agricultural estates worked by the serfs. Agriculture dominated the economy, but innovations such as the heavy plow and the three field system really increased productivity. The Black Death weakened both feudalism and manorialism by creating a labor shortage and increasing peasant bargaining power. And finally, interactions with the Islamic world would help transmit knowledge that contributed to European intellectual growth and eventually led to the Renaissance. So, if you can explain the difference between feudalism, manorialism, and connect the Black Plague to the weakening of both systems, you're ready to master the AP exam.